Kenneth Moore had 30 days to prove stable housing, or Brenda would go to the Clark grandparents permanently. The thought circled his mind like a vulture as he stood in the kitchenette of the one-bedroom apartment, staring at the eviction notice taped to the refrigerator beside Brenda's crayon drawing of their family. 3 people in that drawing: himself, Brenda, and Ranger. Michelle's absence rendered an empty space where a 4th figure should have stood. The building's fire alarm shrieked without warning. Ken's vision tunneled. The kitchenette dissolved into forward operating base, Kalsu, 2012 mortar rounds incoming. His hands flew to cover his head. The linoleum became Afghan dust. The shrieking became Corporal Jackson, screaming his name, blood spreading across Jackson's uniform faster than Ken's hands could stop it. Warm weight pressed against his leg. Ranger's nose nudged his palm, applying steady pressure. The Belgian Malinois leaned harder, forcing Ken's breathing to regulate. 5 things you can see: the refrigerator, Brenda's drawing, the eviction notice, the cracked linoleum. Ranger's brown eyes locked on his. The alarm stopped. Ken's lungs remembered how to expand. Ranger sat waiting, patient as winter. Brenda emerged from the bathroom, 9 years old and already fluent in crisis management. She didn't ask if he was okay. She'd learned that question made things worse. "Burnt toast again, Mr. Patterson downstairs." Her voice carried the practiced steadiness of someone who'd talked her father back from worse. "Want me to make breakfast?" 300 miles separated them from the answer Ken needed. The will reading was scheduled for 2 o'clock, and the lawyer's tone on the phone had suggested nothing good waited in that Manhattan conference room. But attending meant leaving Brenda alone for 8 hours, and the Clark grandparents' motion cited every absence as evidence of neglect. Ken's phone buzzed. Text from the custody lawyer: "Discovery phase complete. They documented 47 code violations in your apartment. Hearing moved up to January 15th. That's 30 days. Brenda read the tension in his shoulders. She crossed the kitchenette, wrapping both arms around his waist in a hug that somehow steadied the ground beneath his feet. "We'll be okay, Daddy." Ken wanted to believe her, but 9-year-olds shouldn't have to promise their parents that survival was possible. The drive to Manhattan took 4 hours through late December cold. Ranger rode in the back seat, alert to every shift in Ken's breathing pattern. The dog had been with him since 2014, matched through the VA after the 3rd hospitalization for what the doctors called acute traumatic stress response, and what Ken called waking up screaming in grocery stores. The law firm occupied the 40th floor of a building that cost more per square foot than Ken earned in 6 months. Mahogany paneling, leather chairs that probably had names, a receptionist whose smile didn't reach past her professionally maintained teeth. His brother Ronald arrived 10 minutes late because men like Ron measured power in how long others waited. The suit probably cost $4,000. The watch definitely cost more than Ken's truck. Pamela walked 2 steps behind her husband, designer heels clicking against marble with metronomic precision. Ron's eyes swept over Ken's Goodwill sport coat and found it lacking. "Kenny, you actually showed." The nickname landed like a punch, designed to shrink Ken back into the younger brother who'd never measured up. "Thought you might skip? Heard you've been having episodes." Pamela's smile sharpened. "How's the apartment situation? We heard the landlord's filing eviction." Ken kept his hands in his lap, aware that Brenda was watching, learning what strength looked like under pressure. Ranger positioned himself between Ken's chair and Ron's, a 60-pound barrier of controlled aggression. The lawyer Coleman entered with the self-importance of a man whose billable hours funded vacation homes. He didn't acknowledge Ken beyond a dismissive nod, focusing his attention on Ron as he opened the leather portfolio containing their mother's last will and testament. The reading proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency. Real estate holdings, investment portfolios valued at $12 million, Connecticut property, trust funds established in 1998. Every word confirmed what Ken had known since childhood, that love in the Moore family flowed toward Ron with the inevitability of water finding downhill paths, while Ken had spent 35 years learning to survive drought. Coleman's voice flattened as he reached the final provision. "And to my youngest son, Kenneth Moore." The pause stretched long enough for Ken to catalog every eye in the room, tracking to his face. "I leave nothing. He has cost this family enough." The words hit like incoming fire. Brenda's hand found his small fingers threading through his larger ones with pressure that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. We'll survive this too." But her other hand trembled against his palm, betraying the 9-year-old fear beneath the brave exterior. Ron leaned back in his chair, satisfaction rolling off him like cologne. The smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It never did, but the triumph blazed clear enough. "Well," Ron addressed the room rather than Ken directly. "Mother was always practical. Kenny's situation speaks for itself." Coleman shuffled papers with theatrical precision, letting silence amplify the humiliation. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something almost apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "The estate settlement does require certain formalities, Mr. Moore. If you could remain for—" "We're leaving." Ken stood, pulling Brenda close. Ranger moved instantly to heel position, reading the spike in Ken's pulse rate. The dog's eyes never left Ron's face, that unwavering stare that had made more than one hostile contact reconsider their approach. Ron's voice followed them toward the door, casual cruelty wrapped in false concern. "The custody hearing is in 30 days, Kenny. You might want to find a lawyer, though I suppose you'd need money for that." He paused, timing the knife twist. "If you need help, financial help, we can discuss terms. Family rates, of course." Ken's hand froze on the door handle. The shame burned hotter than shrapnel wounds, like every scar and nerve ending simultaneously catching fire. He'd borrowed money from Ron twice before. Once to cover Michelle's final hospital bills when insurance maxed out. Once to keep electricity running after Ken lost his warehouse job following a panic attack during inventory. Both times, Ron had made sure the debt felt heavier than currency. Brenda tugged his jacket, pulling him forward before the shame could root him in place. "Let's go, Daddy, please." The hallway outside felt colder. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that sent Ken's mind spiraling toward war zones and mortar attacks and friends dying in dust. He knelt beside Ranger, resting his forehead against the dog's warm flank, letting the animal's steady breathing regulate his own. Brenda wrapped both arms around them, creating a three-way anchor in an empty hallway while expensive shoes clicked past on their way to important meetings about important things. "I don't care what Uncle Ron says," her whisper pressed against Ken's shoulder. "You're the best daddy ever." The words should have comforted. Instead, they magnified the weight pressing down on Ken's chest. Best daddy ever, and he couldn't keep a roof over her head. Best daddy ever, and strangers were deciding whether he deserved to parent his own child. Best daddy ever, and he'd just been publicly disowned by his mother's corpse. Footsteps approached rapid and purposeful. A woman's voice called out slightly breathless, "Mr. Moore Kenneth, please wait." Ken turned, automatically shifting to put himself between Brenda and the approaching stranger. Years of convoy duty had trained certain responses that never quite faded. Always know your exits. Always protect your six. Always assume unknown contacts might be hostile until proven otherwise. The woman who hurried toward them looked nothing like the polished corporate attorneys inside. Mid-50s dark hair pulled back practically, rather than fashionably, glasses slightly fogged from rushing. She carried a worn leather messenger bag instead of a briefcase, and her sensible flats suggested someone who valued function over image. Most importantly, her eyes held genuine concern instead of the calculated sympathy Ken had learned to recognize and distrust. She slowed as she approached, raising both hands in a gesture that read as calming rather than threatening. "My name is Rebecca Flores. I'm an attorney, but not for them." Her voice carried conviction and something that sounded like anger on Ken's behalf. "I need to give you something before you disappear into the city." Ken's guard stayed up muscle memory from too many ambushes disguised as friendly encounters. His hand tightened protectively on Brenda's shoulder. "If this is about the custody case," Rebecca shook her head firmly. "This is about your aunt, Shirley Whitmore." The name hit sideways, dredging up half-formed childhood memories. An old woman at the edge of family gatherings, always watching him with eyes that carried knowledge he couldn't decode. Someone his mother refused to speak to, whose name made his father's jaw tighten. A ghost from a family history Ken had never been allowed to understand. Rebecca reached into her messenger bag and withdrew an envelope, cream-colored and thick with age at the edges. Ken's name was written across the front in looping handwriting that seemed to carry its own weight, its own history. Kenneth Thomas Moore. The middle name gave him pause. Thomas had been his grandfather's name, the one decent man in a family tree full of thorns. Rebecca's voice softened. "Shirley passed away 6 weeks ago. She left explicit instructions: deliver this to you immediately after your mother's will was read, not before. She knew what would happen in there." Rebecca glanced back toward the conference room, her expression suggesting she'd witnessed more than one family destroy itself over money. "She wanted you to have options they couldn't take away." Brenda spoke up, her child's directness cutting through adult complexity. "Did Aunt Shirley like my daddy?" Rebecca knelt slightly, meeting Brenda at eye level. "Honey, your Aunt Shirley loved your daddy more than anyone in that room ever did. She just couldn't tell him until now." Ken took the envelope with hands that had steadied somewhat. The paper felt substantial, important, like it carried more than words. Ranger sniffed at it curiously, then sat with a small huff that Ken had learned to interpret as approval. Whatever was inside the dog didn't sense danger. The seal broke easily under Ken's thumb. Inside a single sheet of paper, handwritten with the careful precision of someone who understood their words would outlive them. "My dear Kenneth, you do not know me, but I have known you all your life. I remember the boy who stood alone at family gatherings while others laughed and pretended not to see him. I remember your father's funeral, how you wore your dress uniform and held your spine straight while your mother refused to acknowledge your presence. I know what they did to you. I lived it long before you were born. That's why I made a choice. The only one I could trust to carry what I built was you. Whitmore Manor in Ridgemont, Montana, now belongs to you. The deed is enclosed. Go there. Take Brenda. Everything will make sense in time. Your strength has been tested 1,000 times by war and family both, but the true test begins now. With love, Aunt Shirley Ken read the letter 3 times while Brenda pressed against his side, trying to peek at words that made no sense. A house, property he'd never seen in a state he'd never visited, from a woman he barely remembered. It felt like a trap or a dream or another cruel joke from a family that specialized in building hope just to watch it collapse. Rebecca must have read the doubt crossing his face. Shirley Whitmore spent 40 years building something remarkable. She was brilliant, complicated, and absolutely certain about 2 things: that your family would destroy you if given the chance, and that you deserve better. Rebecca pulled a document from her bag, official seals and county stamps, making it unmistakably authentic. Whitmore Manor is real substantial and legally yours, 840 acres in the Montana Rockies. The house was built in 1892. It needs work, but it's solid. Brenda tugged Ken's sleeve, her voice pitching higher with excitement. Daddy, we could have a real house, like our own house. The custody papers flashed through Ken's mind. Paragraph 3, subsection B. Petitioner asserts that respondent Kenneth Moore lacks stable housing appropriate for raising a minor child. Current residence is a 1-bedroom apartment with documented code violations. The Clark family's attorney had been thorough, documenting every crack in the plaster every time the heat had failed during winter. Every reason why their granddaughter deserved better than what Ken could provide. But a house in Montana that changed the equation. Stable housing, property ownership, the kind of foundation that family court judges valued above all else. Rebecca seemed to read his thoughts. Shirley anticipated the custody challenge. She left a letter for the judge, too, if it comes to that. But Kenneth, you need to understand something. Her expression grew, serious lines deepening around her mouth. Your brother has been searching for Shirley's property for 20 years. He knows she accumulated significant wealth, and he's convinced it's hidden somewhere. If you go to Montana, he will follow. Ken's tactical mind, the part that had kept him alive through 3 deployments, immediately started calculating timelines and variables. How long before he figures out where we went? The estate transfer won't be public record for another week, maybe 2 if the county office is backed up. Rebecca pulled out a business card and pressed it into Ken's hand. Call me when you arrive. There are things you'll need help understanding, things Shirley left for you to discover. Brenda's small voice cut through the adult conversation. Can Ranger come too? Rebecca smiled, the first genuine warmth Ken had seen from anyone except his daughter in months. Honey, Ranger is part of why Shirley chose your dad. She understood that warriors need their battle brothers, even the ones with 4 legs. The elevator dinged behind them. Ron's voice carried through the closing doors. already on his phone, probably instructing his attorney to accelerate the custody proceedings. Now that Ken had walked out, the clock was ticking. 3 weeks until the hearing. No home, no income, and a daughter who trusted him completely despite overwhelming evidence that maybe possibly she shouldn't. Ken looked down at Brenda. She gazed back up at him with Michelle's eyes dark brown and impossibly trusting, seeing the best in him even when he couldn't see it himself. His wife had made him promise during those final days in hospice while cancer ate her from the inside, and Brenda slept fitfully in the chair beside the bed, exhausted from watching her mother fade. Keep Brenda close. Keep her safe. Don't let my parents turn her into what they tried to make me. Fight for her even when you don't think you can fight for yourself. Ken had kept every promise he'd made to Michelle, except one. He hadn't been able to give Brenda the stable, secure life she deserved. Maybe Montana was his chance to finally deliver. Ken folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket along with the deed. When he spoke, his voice came out steadier than he felt. When you say the house needs work, what exactly are we talking about? Rebecca's expression suggested she was choosing her words carefully. It's been vacant for 6 months since Shirley's passing. Before that, she lived there alone for 40 years. The bones are solid, but it's going to need attention. Heating, plumbing, electrical, all functional, but dated. She paused, weighing whether to continue. And there's a blizzard warning for Ridgemont County. If you're going, you need to leave today. The mountain roads close fast once winter hits. Ken pulled out his phone, checked the weather radar. A massive system was moving across the northern Rockies, promising to dump 3 feet of snow across Montana within 72 hours. After that, the forecast showed nothing but white for days. If they went now, they'd be racing the storm. If they didn't go, they'd be stuck in New York with no home and a custody hearing that grew more inevitable with each passing day. Brenda seemed to sense the decision forming. She wrapped both arms around Ken's waist, pressing her face against his side. I want to go, Daddy. I want to see our house. Our house. Not just a house. Not Aunt Shirley's house, but ours. The possessive pronoun carried more weight than all the legal documents in Rebecca's messenger bag. Brenda had already claimed it, already imagined a future where they belonged somewhere together. Ranger nudged Ken's hand with his cold nose. That particular push that meant decision time. Move or stay, but choose. The dog had pulled Ken out of more than one paralysis spiral. Those moments when too many variables created gridlock in a brain already fragmented by trauma. Sometimes the best decision was just any decision. Action over analysis. Movement over stagnation. Ken extended his hand to Rebecca. Thank you for finding us, for this. She shook his hand firmly. Thank you for going. Shirley spent her last 6 months planning this transfer, making sure everything was legally airtight. She wanted you to have what was always meant to be yours. Rebecca handed him another card, this one with a phone number written on the back. That's my cell. Use it anytime, day or night. And, Kenneth, she waited until he met her eyes. Shirley believed in you. Maybe it's time you believed in yourself. The words settled uncomfortably against everything Ken had internalized about his own worth. Men who had full panic attacks in Walmart checkout lines didn't deserve belief. Fathers who could barely keep electricity running didn't deserve trust. Veterans who woke screaming from nightmares about friends bleeding out in Afghan dust didn't deserve second chances. But Brenda deserved better than watching her father surrender. They walked to the parking garage in silence, Ken carrying Brenda's overnight bag while Ranger maintained his protective position. The old Ford truck looked even more decrepit next to the luxury vehicles filling the Manhattan garage, rust showing through blue paint, passenger door held closed with wire, engine that coughed like a 2-pack-a-day smoker. But it ran mostly, and Ken knew how to fix what broke. Skills learned in motor pools across 3 continents had unexpected civilian applications. Brenda climbed into the back seat without being asked, buckling herself in while Ranger hopped up beside her. The dog would ride back there for the entire journey, Ken knew, providing warmth and security for a girl who'd already lost too much. Good dogs understood grief better than therapists ever could. Ken sat behind the wheel for a long moment, key in the ignition, but not yet turning. Montana was 2,000 miles west, 2 days of driving through weather that would only get worse. They had $53, half a tank of gas, and a destination that might be salvation or just another form of disaster. But staying meant watching Brenda's grandparents take her away in 30 days. Staying meant Ron's smug satisfaction, another victory for cruelty over courage. Staying meant surrendering the first real chance Ken had been offered since Michelle died. He turned the key. The engine stuttered caught again. Good enough. Brenda leaned forward between the seats, her small voice carrying determination that should have belonged to someone older. "Daddy, we're treasure hunters now. Aunt Shirley left us a mystery to solve." Ken checked the rearview mirror, meeting his daughter's eyes. "Yeah, baby, I guess we are." The truck pulled out of the parking garage into late afternoon traffic, heading west toward highways that would carry them away from everything familiar. Ranger pressed his warm bulk against Brenda's side, the dog's steady breathing creating a rhythm that regulated both human heartbeats. They were leaving behind family who'd never wanted them heading toward a house from a woman they'd never known, chasing the possibility that possibly somewhere in Montana there existed a place they could finally belong. Snow started falling as they crossed into New Jersey, light flakes that promised heavier weather ahead. Ken gripped the steering wheel and drove toward the unknown, toward the mountains, toward whatever waited at Whitmore Manor. Behind them, Ron was already making calls, already planning how to take away the one thing Ken had left. But Ron hadn't counted on one variable Ken had survived worse than family betrayal. He'd survived watching friends die. He'd survived coming home to a country that thanked him for his service but wouldn't hire him for steady work. He'd survived watching cancer steal the only woman who'd ever loved him unconditionally. He'd survived this too, for Brenda, for Ranger, for the ghost of a woman named Shirley who'd seen something in him worth protecting. The highway stretched ahead, disappearing into gathering dusk. 2 days to Montana. 2 days to outrun the storm, both the meteorological one and the one Ron would bring when he discovered where they'd gone. Ken pressed the accelerator and drove toward the only chance he had left. The first day passed in a blur of interstate monotony, punctuated by truck stop coffee and cheap gas station sandwiches. Brenda did homework in the back seat, her math workbook propped against Ranger's flank, while the dog dozed and miles rolled past like credits. Ken drove in long stretches, pushing through until exhaustion forced stops, hyper-aware of every dollar spent on food and fuel. $53 became 37, then 22. Then Ken was using the emergency credit card he'd promised himself to save for actual emergencies. A house in Montana qualified as emergency enough. They spent the first night in a budget motel outside Cleveland, the kind of place that charged by the hour and didn't ask questions about large dogs. Ken lay awake while Brenda slept between him and Ranger, listening to his daughter's soft breathing and the rumble of trucks on the nearby highway. His phone buzzed twice with messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Probably the Clark family's attorney trying to serve additional papers. He silenced it. The second day brought them into the Great Plains landscape, flattening into horizons so vast they made Ken's chest tight with a different kind of anxiety. Too much open space, too many sight lines, no cover, no concealment, no way to control the environment. Combat instincts never quite shut off, especially when carrying precious cargo. Brenda noticed his tension during a gas station stop somewhere in South Dakota. She climbed out of the truck and took his hand with the solemnity of a much older child. "Daddy, do the 5 things exercise." Ken blinked, pulled back from scanning for threats that existed only in his rewired nervous system. The 5 things exercise his therapist's gift for managing acute anxiety. 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Grounding techniques for men whose minds sometimes forgot which country they were in. He knelt to Brenda's level, let her steady voice guide him back. 5 things, Daddy. Tell me. I see you. I see Ranger. I see the truck. I see mountains ahead. Ken took a shaky breath. I see your smile. 4 things you can touch. Ken reached out, her shoulder warm and solid, the cold metal of the truck bed, Ranger's fur as the dog moved close, the rough fabric of his own jacket. 3 things you hear, your voice, the wind, that semi-shifting gears over there. 2 things you smell, gas fumes, your strawberry shampoo. 1 thing you taste, the coffee I had an hour ago. It was terrible. Brenda giggled, the sound bright against the flat prairie wind. Motel coffee is always terrible. Mama used to say that. The mention of Michelle settled warm and painful in Ken's chest. She'd taught Brenda the grounding technique during Ken's worst months after coming home, when panic attacks came 3 times a day, and Ken couldn't explain to a 7-year-old why Daddy sometimes forgot where he was. Michelle had been patient, practical, perfect in ways Ken had never deserved. And now she was gone, and their daughter was teaching him the techniques her mother had passed down, and the world kept spinning. No matter how much it hurt, they bought gas, bought more terrible coffee, bought a bag of apples because Brenda insisted they needed something healthy. Then, back on the highway, pushing west, racing weather that darkened the sky ahead like a promise of consequences. Montana appeared gradually, the landscape rising and folding into foothills that grew into proper mountains. Snow began falling as they crossed the state line, light at first, then heavier fat flakes that stuck to the windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The radio crackled with weather advisories, static-laced voices warning of conditions that would trap the unprepared. Blizzard warning in effect for all Rocky Mountain counties, travel highly discouraged, whiteout conditions expected after nightfall. Brenda pressed her face to the window, watching the world turn white. It's like we're driving into a snow globe, Daddy. Ken's hands tightened on the wheel. Visibility was dropping fast, the road ahead disappearing into curtains of white that made depth perception a cruel guessing game. The GPS flickered, struggling with satellite reception through the storm. But the directions were simple enough. Highway 12 until Ridgemont County, then north on Forest Service Road 47 for 15 miles until the turnoff marked only by a stone gate. The stone gate materialized out of the blizzard like something from a ghost story. Granite pillars flanking a narrow drive carved with a single word, Whitmore. The letters were weathered but still legible, suggesting someone had maintained the entrance even while the house beyond remained empty. Ken turned onto the drive, carefully feeling the truck's tires slip on fresh snow before finding purchase. The road, barely wider than a single lane, climbed steeply through dense pine forest branches, heavy with snow, reaching overhead like a tunnel. No tire tracks preceded them. No one had been here recently, or, if they had, the storm had erased all evidence. Brenda's voice carried a tremor that might have been excitement or fear. How far to the house? Map says 3 miles from the gate. Ken kept his voice steady, not mentioning that 3 miles in these conditions could take an hour, or that if they got stuck out here, help wouldn't come until the storm passed. Days, possibly. Ranger stood in the back seat, bracing himself against the turn's ears alert. The dog's behavior had shifted from relaxed travel mode to something more vigilant, that watchfulness that preceded finding danger or reaching a destination. Ken had learned to trust the animal's instincts more than his own damaged ones. The house emerged from the storm without warning, massive and looming, a Victorian Gothic structure that shouldn't exist this far from civilization. 3 stories of dark wood and stone, towers with peaked roofs, gables and dormers, and enough windows to light a small town. Every surface was covered in snow, icicles hanging from the wraparound porch like frozen sentinels. No light showed in any window. No smoke rose from the 3 chimneys. The place looked abandoned, haunted, impossible. Brenda's voice came out barely a whisper, awe overtaking fear. "Daddy, it's huge. Aunt Shirley lived here all by herself." Ken pulled the truck as close to the front steps as the drifts allowed and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No traffic noise, no city sounds, just wind howling through vents and the creak of old wood under the weight of snow. The isolation was complete. They were alone out here, miles from help, surrounded by wilderness and weather and a house that looked like it held more secrets than rooms. Ranger jumped out first, landing in snow up to his chest, immediately beginning a perimeter check that was pure military training. The dog circled the truck, then moved toward the house, testing each step, reading the environment in ways humans couldn't match. When he reached the porch stairs and barked once clear, sharp, all good signal, Ken allowed himself to breathe. Brenda scrambled out her winter coat, already dusted white with snow. She stared up at the house with the kind of wonder only children could manage when faced with the impossible. "We're going to live in a castle. It's just a house baby." But even as Ken said it, he knew the words were inadequate. This wasn't just a house any more than combat was just loud. This was legacy history weight. This was Shirley's entire adult life crystallized into architecture. This was home or prison sanctuary or trap, and he wouldn't know which until they stepped inside. The front door was solid oak, 10 feet tall, carved with patterns that might have been vines or might have been something else entirely. Ken pulled the key from his pocket, old brass worn smooth by decades of use, and fitted it into the lock. The mechanism turned smoothly, too smoothly for something that should have seized from months of winter weather. Someone had maintained this. Someone had been here. The door swung open on hinges that didn't squeak, revealing darkness beyond. Ken pulled out his phone, activated the flashlight, and stepped across the threshold with Ranger close at his side and Brenda gripping the back of his jacket. The beam cut through dust and shadows, illuminating a grand foyer that belonged in a museum. Marble floors veined with darker stone. A sweeping double staircase rising to the second floor. Walls paneled in wood so dark it was almost black. Furniture shapes lurked under white dust sheets like ghosts waiting for resurrection. The air smelled of cold and age and something floral, perfume or flowers, or the lingering scent of a woman who'd died 6 weeks ago. Brenda's voice echoed off the high ceiling. "It's not scary, it's beautiful." Ken wasn't sure he agreed, but his daughter's certainty pushed back against the unease coiling in his gut. Ranger trotted forward, sniffing methodically, checking corners and doorways with professional thoroughness. The dog's tail was up, alert but not alarmed, cautious but not afraid. They moved deeper into the house, Ken's flashlight beam revealing room after room of preserved history. A parlor with furniture from another century, a dining room with a table that could seat 20, a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, every spine thick with dust. The kitchen managed to feel both ancient and meticulously maintained, with an old-fashioned stove and modern appliances existing in uneasy cohabitation. Brenda pulled open a cabinet, revealing rows of canned goods arranged with military precision. "Daddy, there's food. Lots of food, like she knew we were coming." Ken checked the dates on the cans. All recent, none more than a year old. Shirley had stocked the house prepared. It left everything they'd need to survive. The gesture hit harder than any inheritance check could have. This was care tangible and practical from a woman who'd known she wouldn't live to see them arrive. But something else caught Ken's attention. On the refrigerator, held by a magnet shaped like Montana, was a drawing, crayon on construction paper, 3 stick figures, tall one, small one, dog, labels in child's handwriting, "Waiting for you." Ken's skin prickled. His flashlight swept the kitchen again, looking for signs of recent presence. Brenda pulled the drawing down, examining it with forensic focus. "Daddy, this is weird. Who drew this?" "I don't know, baby." They found candles in a drawer, matches beside them, and Ken lit 3, placing them carefully around the kitchen. Warm light pushed back the shadows, making the space feel less like a tomb and more like a home waiting to wake. Ranger settled on the floor with a satisfied grunt, claiming territory. Brenda explored cabinets, finding plates and cups organized with thought, including a children's section with unbreakable plastic that made her laugh. "Aunt Shirley definitely knew about me. Look, there's even a pink cup with horses." Ken examined the cup, noting the price tag still attached. Purchased recently deliberately for a child Shirley had never met, but somehow knew would need a pink cup with horses. The attention to detail was overwhelming, not just providing shelter, but anticipating needs, imagining futures, building toward a possibility Shirley herself wouldn't witness. They ate a quiet dinner of soup heated on the stove after Ken figured out the propane system. Brenda talked between spoonfuls, her exhaustion from 2 days of travel bleeding through excitement. "Can I pick my room? Can Ranger sleep with me? Can we explore more tomorrow?" "Yes, yes, and we'll see. First, let's find somewhere warm to sleep." The second floor revealed 6 bedrooms, each furnished, but covered in the same dust sheets as downstairs. Ken chose 2 rooms side by side, one slightly smaller, clearly prepared for a child, books on the shelves, toys in a chest, paintings of animals on the walls. Brenda claimed it, immediately pulling dust covers off furniture to reveal a 4-poster bed that looked straight out of a fairy tale. "This is the best room ever. Did Aunt Shirley have kids?" "I don't think so." Ken pulled blankets from a cedar chest, shaking out moths and years. "But she wanted someone to use this room, someone small." "Me?" Brenda climbed onto the bed, bouncing once. "She wanted me to use it. She knew I'd come here with you, even though she never met us. That's like Magic Daddy." "Not magic. Planning. Obsessive detailed planning by a woman who'd watched from the shadows and prepared for every contingency." Ken tucked Brenda in, piling blankets until only her face showed her dark hair spreading across the pillow. Ranger jumped up without permission, curling at the foot of the bed like a living furnace. "I'm not scared here." Brenda's voice was already fading toward sleep. "It feels safe, like Aunt Shirley is still taking care of us." Ken kissed her forehead. "Get some sleep, treasure hunter. Tomorrow we explore." He left the door cracked and crossed to his own room, smaller but adequate, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the front drive. Snow was still falling, accumulation building on the porch railing. They were well and truly snowed in now. No leaving until the storm passed and roads cleared. Trapped here for better or worse. Ken laid down fully clothed, too wired to sleep, despite bone-deep exhaustion. The house settled around him, wood creaking, wind howling normal sounds that his combat-trained brain insisted on cataloging as potential threats. But beneath the ordinary noises, something else. Footsteps, maybe, soft and careful, moving somewhere on the floor below. He sat up, pulse hammering. Probably just the house settling. Probably thermal contraction from the temperature drop. Probably anything except what his paranoid military mind immediately assumed someone else was here. Ranger's growl carried from Brenda's room, low and sustained. The dog had heard it too. Ken moved into the hallway, phone flashlight cutting through darkness. Ranger stood at the top of the stairs, every muscle taut, staring down into the foyer. Ken joined him, peering into the gloom below. Nothing visible, no movement, but the feeling of being watched, pressed against his skin like humidity. "Stay with Brenda." Ken gave the command quietly. Ranger obeyed instantly, returning to guard post at the child's bedside. Ken descended alone, each step an exercise in controlled fear. The marble foyer stretched empty below, exactly as they'd left it. But something had changed. He felt it before he saw it. Door that had been closed, now standing ajar. The library. They'd closed that door. Ken was certain. He remembered checking it specifically, making sure the house was secured before they went upstairs. He approached slowly, every sense hyper-alert. The door swung open at his touch, revealing the library's darkness beyond. Ken swept his flashlight across rows of bookshelves, finding nothing but leather spines and dust. Then the beam caught something on the reading table near the window. A journal open, dust around it disturbed as if by a hand. Ken moved closer, forcing himself to breathe steadily. The journal was old, leather-bound, filled with Shirley's handwriting. The page it was open to was dated 6 months ago, 2 weeks before her death. I know my time is short. The doctors give me weeks, maybe days, but I have no regrets. This house has been my refuge from a world that tried to break me, and now it will be his. Kenneth is stronger than he knows, stronger even than the blood that rejected him. He will find what I've left. He will understand why I chose him. He must. Ken's hand shook as he read. Shirley had known death was coming, had prepared for it, had arranged everything down to this moment. But the journal had been closed when they arrived. He was certain, which meant someone had been here in the house while they slept. Someone had opened this book to this specific page. Someone wanted him to read these words. A whisper came from everywhere, and nowhere so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "Welcome home, Kenneth." Female voice. Elderly. Familiar in a way that made no sense because he'd never heard Shirley speak. Ken spun flashlight cutting wild arcs through the library. Empty. No one. Just books and shadows and the impossible echo of words that couldn't have been spoken. He grabbed the journal and backed out of the room, pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't PTSD. Ranger had heard the footsteps too. The door had opened itself. The journal had been placed deliberately. Something in this house was wrong, or right in ways that defied rational explanation. Ken took the stairs 2 at a time, returning to Brenda's room. She slept peacefully, Ranger still on guard. The dog's eyes tracked Ken's agitated movements, but didn't signal alarm. Ken sank into the chair beside the bed, journal clutched in his hands, and forced himself to read more. The entries detailed Shirley's life, her choices, her regrets. A woman who'd fled an abusive family, built a fortune through intelligence and determination, spent 40 years watching Ken from a distance. The final entries were addressed directly to him, written in the careful script of someone who knew their words would outlive them. "If you're reading this, you've found the house. Good. Ronald will come looking. He's been searching for my assets for 2 decades. Let him search. What matters most is hidden where only you can find it. Follow what doesn't make sense. Trust what seems impossible. And, Kenneth, keep Brenda close. She sees more clearly than you do." Ken looked at his sleeping daughter, 9 years old and already carrying wisdom earned through loss. She'd navigated his PTSD with more grace than most adults managed. She'd stood up to Ron in that conference room. She'd decided without hesitation that this house was theirs, that Aunt Shirley's ghost was benevolent, that treasure hunting was the adventure they needed. Maybe she was right. Maybe children understood mysteries better than traumatized veterans did. Ken settled into the chair, determined to stay awake to guard his daughter and process the impossible. But exhaustion finally won, dragging him under into restless sleep, punctuated by dreams of footsteps and whispers and a woman he'd never known who'd somehow known him completely. When morning light filtered through the window, turning frost to diamonds, Brenda's excited voice pulled Ken fully awake. "Daddy, Ranger found something. You have to see." Ken stumbled out of the chair, muscles protesting 2 days of driving and 1 night spent upright. Brenda was already dressed, bouncing with limitless energy, pointing at Ranger, who stood at the bedroom door with something in his mouth. He went downstairs and came back with this. "I think it's important." Ken took the object from Ranger's gentle grip, a small wooden box carved with the same vine pattern as the front door, sealed with a brass clasp. No dust on it. Recently placed, recently found. The box opened with surprising ease, the brass clasp yielding under Ken's thumb as if recently oiled. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay a single brass key and a folded note in Shirley's precise handwriting. For the vault guardian, the date a grandmother's heart broke and healed. That's your combination. Let Brenda solve it. Children see what we've forgotten how to look for. Brenda leaned over his arm, studying the key with solemn focus. Her finger traced the worn edges. A vault? Like in banks. We have a vault. Ken turned the key over, noting the unusual length, the complexity of the teeth. This wasn't hardware store standard. This opened something serious, something built to last and protect. I don't know what we have yet, but Aunt Shirley wants you to figure it out. Ken handed his daughter the note. What do you think it means? Brenda read slowly, lips moving over the words, her face scrunched in concentration. That expression Michelle used to call her thinking face, nose-wrinkled eyes, narrowed, totally absorbed. After a moment, she looked up with sudden brightness. We need to explore more. Vaults are hidden. That's what makes them secret. The logic was irrefutable. Ken pocketed the key and followed his daughter downstairs, Ranger trailing with the alert patience of a working dog who understood missions came in many forms. Morning light through the tall windows revealed details missed in last night's darkness, the intricate ceiling moldings, the quality of craftsmanship in every doorframe, the sense that wealth had been applied with taste rather than ostentation. Brenda moved through rooms with fearless curiosity, pulling dust sheets off furniture, examining paintings, opening drawers. In the parlor, she discovered a collection of photographs in silver frames, decades of images showing Shirley at different ages. A young woman with defiant eyes standing beside an easel, middle-aged Shirley shaking hands with men in business suits. Elderly Shirley, in this very room, the background unmistakable, her expression carrying satisfaction and sadness in equal measure. She was pretty, and she looks kind. Brenda traced Shirley's face through the glass. Why didn't she ever visit us? The question cut deeper than a child could understand. Ken chose truth over comfort. Sometimes families break apart. Sometimes people have to love each other from far away because being close is too dangerous. Because of Grandma and Uncle Ron. The insight shouldn't have surprised him. Brenda had witnessed enough family toxicity to recognize patterns. She'd been there when the Clark grandparents told Ken he was unfit. She'd heard Ron's casual cruelty yesterday. 9 years old and already learning that blood ties guaranteed nothing except genetic similarity. Yeah, baby, because of them. Brenda nodded, accepting this, then turned back to her exploration. She worked methodically, checking every room on the first floor, searching for something she couldn't name but would recognize when found. Ranger shadowed her movements, occasionally sniffing corners or pawing at baseboards. The dog's behavior had shifted from protective to investigative, following some scent or instinct that Ken couldn't detect. The library drew Brenda back, despite Ken's discomfort with the room. She moved along the bookshelves, running her fingers across spines, pulling volumes out to examine titles. History, philosophy, art criticism, technical manuals on subjects ranging from carpentry to computer programming. Shirley had been voracious, eclectic, someone who consumed knowledge the way others consumed entertainment. Brenda stopped at the far wall, head tilted, studying something Ken couldn't see. She reached up to touch the wooden paneling, pressing gently. "Daddy, this sounds different. Hollow." Ken joined her, rapping his knuckles against the wood. Solid in most places, but where Brenda indicated hollow definitely. He ran his hands along the panel edges, searching for seams or mechanisms. Nothing obvious presented itself, but children had advantages adults surrendered. They were closer to the ground, their perspective different, their expectations unclouded by assumptions. "Ranger check!" Ken gave the command more from habit than expectation, but the dog responded immediately, nosing along the base of the panel. Ranger pawed twice at a specific spot, then sat and barked his signal for "found something important." Ken knelt, examining where Ranger indicated. A small indentation in the wood, barely visible, positioned too low for adult eye level, but perfect for a kneeling child. Ken pressed it. Something clicked deep within the wall. The entire panel swung inward with smooth silence, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward into darkness. Brenda's gasp carried pure delight. "Secret passage! Aunt Shirley built us a secret passage." The stairs were steep, clearly not designed for regular use. Ken went first, phone flashlight, illuminating stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The passage climbed between walls, tight and claustrophobic, emerging into a space that stole Ken's breath. Shirley's studio occupied the entire third floor, hidden above the house's conventional layout. Skylights filtered morning sun through snow, casting the room in ethereal blue-white luminescence. Canvases covered every wall, landscapes, portraits, abstract compositions that captured emotion and color and form. Paint-splattered tables held brushes, palettes, jars of pigments, arranged with obsessive organization. This was where Shirley had lived her real life, away from the world below, creating art no one had been permitted to see. Brenda spun slowly, taking in the impossible beauty. She was an artist, a real artist. Look at all of this. Ken moved to the center easel, where an unfinished painting stopped his heart. Whitmore Manor rendered in winter snow, covering everything, smoke rising from chimneys. In the foreground, approaching the front door, 3 figures. A man, a child, holding the man's hand, a dog. The detail was extraordinary. Ranger's distinctive markings, Brenda's blue winter coat, Ken's military posture even in civilian clothes. Shirley had painted their arrival before it happened, had imagined this moment with such precision that Ken could almost believe in prophecy. "That's us." Brenda pressed close to his side. "How did she know what I look like? How did she know Ranger?" Ken had no answer. Coincidence felt inadequate. Shirley couldn't have known they'd arrived during a blizzard, couldn't have predicted Brenda's coat color or Ranger's placement. Yet here was evidence suggesting otherwise, proof that a dead woman had seen the future, or had orchestrated events with such precision that prediction became unnecessary. Against the far wall, Brenda discovered sketchbooks stacked chronologically, dates written on each spine. She opened the most recent, flipping through pages of drawings, the house in different seasons, portraits of people Ken didn't recognize, and increasingly, toward the end, sketches of a child's face from multiple angles, different ages, showing growth from infant to approximately 9 years old. The final sketch was dated 3 months before Shirley's death. A girl who could have been Brenda's twin down to the small scar on her chin from a playground fall 2 years ago. "Daddy, she drew me. She drew me at all my ages, even the scar." Brenda touched the drawing, then her own chin. "That's impossible." "Yeah, it is." Ken's voice came out rougher than intended. He cleared his throat. "Unless she had pictures. Maybe someone sent her photos of you." But that raised different questions. Who had been feeding Shirley information? Who had been watching them, documenting Brenda's growth, providing updates to a woman the family had ostracized? The surveillance implications should have frightened Ken, but instead he felt something closer to gratitude. Someone had cared enough to keep Shirley informed. Someone had helped her plan for this moment. Brenda moved to a wooden cabinet against the wall, its surface carved with the same vine pattern that decorated the front door and the mysterious box. She tried the handle, locked. Then she noticed something Ken missed, a small panel above the handle's smooth wood that didn't quite match the surrounding grain. "Daddy, look, I think it's a puzzle." Ken examined the panel, pressure-sensitive, slightly yielding under his touch. He pressed different sections experimentally, feeling mechanisms engage and release. After several attempts, a pattern emerged. The panel had 4 distinct zones that clicked when pushed in sequence. A combination lock built into wood, elegant and completely hidden unless you knew to look. Brenda pulled Shirley's note from her pocket, reading aloud. The date, "A grandmother's heart broke and healed." That's the combination. Ken's mind worked through possibilities. Shirley's son, his father, had been born March 12, 1962. That must have been when her heart broke, giving up a child to forced adoption. But when did it heal? When she learned about Ken, when she discovered he had Brenda try my birthday. Brenda's suggestion cut through Ken's mental calculations. Maybe finding out about me healed her heart. The logic held beautiful simplicity. Ken translated Brenda's birth date into numbers. March 12th, 2019. 3 for March, 12 for the day, 19 for the year, shortened. That matched Shirley's son's birthday, month and day, the year representing Brenda's birth. Ken pressed the zones in sequence. 3 clicks, 12 clicks, 1 click, 9 clicks. The final mechanism engaged with a solid thunk. The cabinet door swung open, revealing a metal box with a keyhole that perfectly matched the brass key from this morning. Brenda bounced on her toes. "I solved it. I solved Aunt Shirley's puzzle." "You did, treasure hunter. You absolutely did." Ken inserted the key, turned it. The box opened to reveal a single folded paper and another key, this one larger, more modern, attached to a tag reading "Vault Level Basement. Emergency Access." The paper was another note from Shirley. "Kenneth and Brenda, if you're reading this, you've proven you work better as a team than apart. The vault requires both of you. Follow the passage behind this cabinet. The final lock needs the poem spoken aloud in Brenda's voice. I designed it that way for a reason. Children carry truth. Adults forget." Brenda practically vibrated with excitement. "There's more. There's a whole vault." Ken examined the cabinet's interior. The back panel wasn't solid wood, but another hidden door, this one with a simple latch. It swung inward, revealing a descending staircase carved from stone, lit by dim emergency lighting that flickered on as they approached. The temperature dropped as they descended each step, taking them deeper into what must be the mountain bedrock beneath the house. The passage leveled out after 30 feet, opening into a chamber that belonged in a bank rather than a residence. Climate-controlled air hummed from hidden vents. LED strips provided cold, bright illumination. And at the chamber center stood a vault door that would have stopped any conventional burglar. 10 inches of steel, combination lock, biometric scanner, and a small bronze plaque engraved with a poem. Brenda read the words carefully, her voice echoing off stone walls. In shadows deep, where truth lies still, where time cannot its secrets kill the rightful one, by courage, led shall claim the path the lost ones tread. The moment she finished, a soft chime echoed through the chamber. The biometric scanner flashed green despite no fingerprint being provided. Mechanical locks began disengaging, heavy bolts retracting with precision that spoke of expensive engineering. The vault door swung open smoothly, revealing an interior that made Ken's knees weak. Rows of climate-controlled cases lined 3 walls each, containing documents sealed in protective plastic. Bearer bonds, stock certificates from companies Ken recognized, tech giants from their earliest days, investments made when success was uncertain, but potential was visible to those who looked carefully. A quick mental calculation suggested values in the tens of millions, possibly higher. The 4th wall held something different, a glass case containing land deeds organized by state. Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, thousands of acres documented with survey maps and legal descriptions. Below the deeds locked drawers, labeled with years ranging from 1970 to 2024. And on a central table, a leather briefcase stood alone, positioned like an offering. Brenda whispered, awestruck, "Daddy, are we rich?" Ken opened the briefcase with shaking hands. Inside, a single typed document summarized Shirley's entire estate. Total liquid assets, $18,400,000. Land holdings valued separately. Instructions for executor enclosed. Beneficiary, Kenneth Thomas Moore, and all his direct descendants in perpetuity. The number didn't feel real. 3 months ago, Ken had been calculating whether they could afford both electricity and heat. Yesterday, his brother had publicly disowned him. This morning, he was apparently wealthier than anyone in his family had ever been, holding wealth that could fund Brenda's entire education, could pay for therapy until his PTSD became manageable, could build a future neither of them had dared imagine. Does this mean we get to stay, that I don't have to live with Grandma and Grandpa Clark? The custody case. Ken had almost forgotten in the shock of discovery, but Brenda hadn't. Of course she hadn't. It was her life being decided, her future hanging on whether a judge believed Ken capable of providing stability. This vault, this wealth, this estate, it changed everything. Stable housing, generational security, the kind of foundation that family court valued above all else. Yeah, baby, this means we get to stay. Ken pulled Brenda into a hug, feeling her small body pressed against his chest, her heart hammering with excitement and relief. Nobody's taking you anywhere. Ranger, who'd been patiently waiting at the vault entrance, suddenly went rigid, his ears pinned forward, focusing on something beyond the chamber. A low growl built in his chest, not the curious alert from earlier, but the warning rumble that preceded danger. Ken's military instincts fired instantly. He pulled Brenda behind him, scanning for threats. The chamber had only one entrance, the stairway they'd descended. If someone was coming, they'd be trapped. No alternate exit visible. No tactical advantage except the narrow approach that would funnel intruders into a kill zone if this were combat. But this wasn't combat. This was Montana, and they were in a house that should have been empty, and someone was approaching fast enough that Ranger considered them a threat. Footsteps echoed down the stone stairs, multiple sets, heavy boots, moving with purpose. Then Ron's voice carried ahead, confident and cruel. "Kenneth, I know you're down here. Come out and let's discuss this like adults." Ken's blood turned to ice. Ron had found them already, less than 18 hours since they'd arrived, and his brother had tracked them across 2,000 miles. The speed suggested preparation. Ron must have known about Whitmore Manor before the will reading must have been waiting for Ken to lead him to Shirley's hidden assets. A woman's sharper voice followed Pamela, dripping false concern. "Kenneth bringing a child to this death trap is criminal negligence. We're documenting everything for the custody hearing." Brenda's hand gripped Ken's jacket, her whisper barely audible. "How did they find us?" Ken had no answer. He'd told no one where they were going. Rebecca Flores had promised confidentiality. Unless Ron had been monitoring Ken's movements, tracking his phone, following them west while maintaining distance, the paranoia Ken usually fought against suddenly felt like validated threat assessment. A third voice joined the others, smooth and lawyerly. "Mr. Moore, this is Richard Coleman, legal counsel. We need to discuss the estate transfer immediately. There are irregularities that require resolution." 3 against 1. Ken had faced worse odds in Afghanistan, but never with his daughter present, never trapped in a basement chamber with a fortune at his back and family at his throat. He looked around desperately for options. The vault itself was a fortress, but staying inside meant siege. The passage offered the only exit currently blocked by Ron's approach. Brenda pulled on his jacket, her voice urgent. "Daddy, the phone. That old phone in the library upstairs. Remember? It was plugged in." Ken remembered. A rotary phone on Shirley's desk, ancient technology that should have been decorative, but had shown a dial tone when he'd tested it yesterday. Landline. Still worked when cell towers failed, when isolation was complete. If Brenda could reach it, "Can you get there without them seeing you?" Brenda nodded. Determination replacing fear. "I'm small. I'm quiet. I can sneak." "Call 911. Tell them men broke into our house and we're scared. Give them the address, Whitmore Manor, Forest Service Road, 47. Can you remember that?" "Yes, FSR 47. I remember." Brenda paused. "What about you and Ranger? We're going to have a conversation with Uncle Ron. Buy you time." Ken cupped her face, forcing confidence he didn't feel. "Stay hidden until help comes. You're the smartest, bravest girl I know. You can do this." Brenda kissed his cheek quickly, then slipped toward a shadow at the chamber's edge that Ken hadn't noticed. A maintenance access tunnel narrow enough that a child could navigate, but an adult would struggle. She disappeared into it like smoke, leaving Ken and Ranger to face the approaching threat alone. Ken stepped out of the vault, positioning himself in the passage so Ron would have to go through him to reach the chamber. Ranger moved to his side, teeth bared every inch the combat dog he'd been trained to be. Whatever happened next, Ron would learn that cornering Ken wasn't the easy victory he'd anticipated. Ron emerged from the stairwell, First, his expensive suit, somehow still pristine despite the journey. Pamela followed in designer winterwear that cost more than Ken's truck. Coleman brought up the rear briefcase in hand, already recording on his phone, documenting evidence-building cases, destroying lives with paperwork. Ron's expression shifted when he saw the vault behind Ken, saw the glimpse of bearer bonds and documents visible through the open door. Greed and triumph warred on his face. "Well, little brother found the jackpot." He let out a low whistle. "I knew Shirley was hiding something, but this—" His eyes tracked across the visible wealth. "This is generational money, and you thought you could keep it to yourself." Ken kept his voice level. "This property belongs to me. You're trespassing. Leave before I call the sheriff." Ron laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Call the sheriff with what phone? We're 20 miles from town. No cell signal. You're isolated, unstable, and clearly incompetent if you think you can manage this kind of estate." He gestured at Coleman, who raised his phone higher, recording everything. "Richard has already filed preliminary paperwork. Shirley's will is being challenged on grounds of undue influence and mental incompetence." Pamela stepped closer, her expression calculating beneath false sympathy. "Kenneth, be reasonable. You're living in a condemned building with a 9-year-old. The house has no heat, no running water, structural damage throughout. You brought Brenda into danger. Child Protective Services will love our documentation." The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Ken had brought Brenda here in desperation, racing a blizzard, trusting a dead woman's letter. He'd exposed his daughter to isolation and unknown risks, but he'd also given her hope. He'd shown her that fighting back was possible, that family could mean something beyond cruelty. Ranger's growl deepened the dog reading Ken's rising anger. Coleman raised his phone higher. "Mr. Moore, I'm recording this conversation. Any threatening behavior will be noted." "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm telling you to leave my property." Ken held Ron's gaze. "You spent 20 years looking for Shirley's assets. She made sure you'd never find them. She chose me specifically because she knew what you'd do exactly what you're doing now." Ron's smile thinned. "She chose you because senility and cancer destroyed her judgment. No sane person leaves a fortune to a PTSD case who can barely hold his life together." The insult should have triggered Ken's panic response, the shame spiral that followed any reminder of his broken pieces. Instead, Ken felt something different crystallizing in his chest. Shirley hadn't chosen him despite his trauma. She'd chosen him because of everything he'd survived, because he understood that strength came in forms Ron's privileged life had never required. "You're right. I have PTSD. I have panic attacks. I wake up screaming sometimes." Ken's voice stayed steady. "But I also have a daughter who loves me, a dog who trusts me, and apparently an aunt who believed I was worth more than all of you combined. So here's what's happening. You're leaving. You're withdrawing the custody challenge. And you're never contacting me or Brenda again." Pamela scoffed. "You think you can dictate terms? We have lawyers, money, influence. And I have evidence." The lie came smoothly, born from 3 tours of tactical deception. "Shirley documented everything. Your financial crimes, Ron. The embezzlement from the family business in '98. The fraud scheme that bankrupted investors in 2005. The tax evasion from 2010 through 2015. Ken watched his brother's face drain of color. She kept everything. Insurance, she called it, for when you inevitably came after what was mine. Coleman's phone lowered slightly. Even Pamela looked uncertain. The bluff worked because it contained enough truth. Shirley had been meticulous, and men like Ron always had secrets worth hiding. "You're lying!" Ron's voice lacked conviction. "You don't have anything. Try me. File your custody motion. Challenge the will. See what gets released to prosecutors." Ken shifted slightly, Ranger moving with him in perfect synchronization. "Or walk away now while you still can." The standoff stretched, tension building until it felt physical. Ron's calculation was visible, weighing the potential fortune against the risk of criminal exposure, deciding which loss he could better survive. Coleman whispered something urgent in Ron's ear. Pamela's expression had shifted from cruelty to fear, then distant but growing louder, a sound that changed everything. Sirens, multiple vehicles approaching fast, the distinctive wail of law enforcement cutting through mountain silence. Ron's face twisted with confusion. "How?" "My daughter called 911. While you were busy threatening us, she was being smart." Ken allowed himself a small smile. "Brenda's good at solving problems. Shirley knew that. She designed the vault's voice lock specifically for a child's voice. Brenda opened doors you could never have found." The sirens grew louder, multiple engines now audible over the alarm. Ron's advantage evaporated as flashing lights began reflecting off stone walls. Pamela grabbed Ron's arm. "We need to leave, now." Coleman was already moving toward the stairs, professional survival instinct overriding client loyalty. Ron hesitated, his gaze lingering on the vault's open door, on the visible fortune he'd spent 2 decades seeking. But even Ron understood when retreat was the only option. "This isn't over, Kenneth. You can't hide behind one lucky phone call forever." "I'm not hiding. I'm home." Ken stood firm as his brother retreated. "This is my house, my land, my daughter's future, and you're never touching any of it again." Ron, Pamela, and Coleman scrambled up the stairs as heavy boots descended from above. Sheriff Donald Harris appeared firsthand, resting near his holster, taking in the scene with practiced assessment. 2 deputies followed, positioning themselves tactically. Behind them came faces Ken didn't recognize. Older men and women in practical winter clothing, townspeople by their bearing expressions showing concern rather than aggression. Donald's voice carried mountain authority. "Somebody want to tell me why I'm responding to a breaking and entering call at Whitmore Manor?" Ken gestured at Ron's retreating back. "My brother and his associates broke into my home. My daughter called for help because they were threatening us." Donald nodded slowly, then called up the stairs. "Ronald Moore, that you up there. We had words about trespassing here yesterday. Told you this property was off limits during probate." Ron's voice drifted back defensive. "Sheriff, this is a family matter. We were just trespassing, breaking and entering, intimidating a veteran and his child." Donald cut him off. "Step outside now. We'll discuss this in town." The sheriff turned to Ken. "You and your girl okay?" "We're fine now. Thank you for coming so fast." "Thank Brenda. Kid gave the dispatcher a perfect description. 3 adults, 1 recording on phone-specific threats about custody. Smart girl you got there." Donald's expression softened. "Also, thank Shirley's friends. Word spreads fast in Ridgemont when something happens at Whitmore. We've been waiting 40 years for Shirley's heir to finally arrive." An older woman pushed past the deputies, her face lined with weather and years, but her eyes bright with purpose. She carried a box that smelled like fresh baking. "I'm Betty Anderson, ran the Ridgemont Diner for 35 years. Shirley was my friend." She thrust the box at Ken. "Brought food. Figured you could use a hot meal after your welcome committee." More townspeople filtered into the chamber, each carrying something: blankets, thermoses of coffee, a portable heater. They moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this before, who understood mountain isolation and looked after their own. An elderly man with carpenter's hands approached. "Harold Jenkins, I'll get your generator running proper." Shirley always kept it maintained, but 6 months without use, things seize up. Ken stood overwhelmed as strangers became neighbors, as Shirley's community extended itself to include him and Brenda by simple virtue of connection. These people had loved his aunt, had benefited from her quiet generosity, and now paid that forward without expectation or hesitation. Donald pulled Ken aside. "Ron's going to cause problems. Men like him don't walk away from this kind of money without a fight. But Ridgemont takes care of its own. Shirley made sure of that for decades. Now it's our turn to make sure her family gets the same protection." Ken's throat tightened. "I don't understand why she never told me. Why she watched from distance instead of—" He couldn't finish the thought. Shirley had her reasons. Some of them she shared, some she took to the grave. Donald's expression carried weight of knowledge he wouldn't fully reveal. "What matters is, you're here now. You and that brave little girl. Speaking of which, where is Brenda?" As if summoned, Brenda appeared at the top of the stairs, Ranger at her side. Her face was flushed with pride. "I did it, Daddy. I called 911 just like you taught me. I told them 3 bad men were scaring us, and they came really fast." Ken climbed the stairs and swept Brenda into his arms, holding her tight while she laughed. Ranger barked once sharp and triumphant celebration and relief combined. They'd survived, they'd fought back, and for the first time since Michelle died, Ken felt something beyond survival. He felt hope that maybe possibly they could actually build the life Shirley had envisioned. Betty's warm voice carried from below. "Bring that child down here. She needs hot chocolate and stories about her great-aunt Shirley. We've got years of them saved up." Ken carried Brenda downstairs, surrounded by strangers who'd become allies in the space of an emergency. The vault stood open behind them, wealth beyond imagination waiting to be managed. But what mattered more was the community gathering in a stone chamber beneath a mountain house, offering warmth and protection to family they'd never met but already claimed as their own. Ron was gone, but his threat remained. The custody hearing still loomed 3 weeks away. The inheritance would face legal challenges that could drag through courts for years. Nothing was settled, nothing guaranteed. But Ken had something now that he'd lacked in that Manhattan law office. He had a home. He had allies. He had proof that Shirley had believed in him enough to build this entire, elaborate treasure hunt. And he had Brenda safe in his arms, brave and brilliant, and absolutely certain they'd won. Outside, through the chamber's ventilation grates, they could hear Ron's raised voice, arguing with deputies, Donald's patient responses, the sound of a vehicle starting, pulling away, carrying threats that would return, but couldn't break what was being built here in Shirley's hidden fortress. Betty handed Brenda a steaming cup. Your aunt used to say, the best revenge against those who doubt you is building something beautiful they can't touch. Looks like you two are off to a good start." Brenda sipped her chocolate, then looked up at Ken with absolute trust. "Daddy, I like our house. Can we keep it forever?" Ken met his daughter's eyes and spoke the truth Shirley had left for him to discover. "Yeah, treasure hunter, forever." But even as the word left his mouth, Ken knew the real battle was just beginning. The custody hearing, Ron's legal challenges, and somewhere in Ridgemont, people who needed to understand that Ken wasn't here to destroy what Shirley had built. He was here to finish it. The townspeople began filtering out, leaving supplies and promises to return. Donald lingered, his expression shifting from protective to cautious. "Ken, I need to level with you. There's something you should know about why folks showed up tonight." He glanced at Betty, who nodded permission. "Shirley promised this town something before she died. Said she'd turn Whitmore Manor into a community center, open the land for public use. People are watching to see if you'll honor that." Ken felt the weight settle on his shoulders. The estate wasn't just his. It came with expectations, with promises Shirley had made, with a community that had supported her for 40 years, and now wanted assurance that her legacy wouldn't be sold to the highest bidder. "I didn't know about any promises." "We figured as much." Betty's voice carried understanding, but also firmness. "That's why we're giving you time. 6 months to figure out what Shirley wanted. But, Ken, if you sell this place to developers, if you break her promise to Ridgemont, we can't protect you from Ron. Won't protect you." The ultimatum was delivered gently, but it was an ultimatum nonetheless. Ken had allies, but their loyalty was conditional on him proving worthy of Shirley's trust, conditional on him becoming the man Shirley believed he could be. Donald extended his hand. 6 months. Show us you're worth what Shirley saw in you." Ken shook it, feeling the calluses of a working man, the grip of someone who measured worth in actions rather than words. "I'll try. Trying's all we're asking." After they left, Ken and Brenda sat in the vault chamber, surrounded by wealth that suddenly felt more like responsibility than freedom. Brenda leaned against his side. "What did Aunt Shirley promise them, Daddy?" "I don't know yet, baby, but I think we need to find out." Ken's phone buzzed, the first signal he'd had since arriving. A text from Rebecca Flores. "Ron filed emergency custody motion. Hearing in 10 days. Call me." 10 days, not 30. Ron had accelerated the timeline, probably hoping to catch Ken off balance to strike before he could establish stability. Ken looked at his daughter, at the vault full of resources at the house above them that could either be sanctuary or burden. 10 days to prove he deserved to keep Brenda. 6 months to prove he deserved Ridgemont's support. And somewhere in between, figure out what Shirley had actually wanted him to do with all of this. The treasure hunt wasn't over. It had barely begun. And the real test wasn't finding the vault. It was figuring out what to build with what was inside it. Brenda's hand found his small fingers threading through his larger ones. "We'll figure it out together, Daddy. That's what treasure hunters do." Ken pulled her close, hoping she was right, hoping that together they could carry the weight of Shirley's faith. Because the alternative, losing Brenda, betraying Shirley's trust, proving Ron right about everything, was unthinkable. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Whitmore Manor in white silence. Somewhere in town, Ron was planning his next move. Somewhere in these walls, Shirley's secrets waited to be discovered. And somewhere in Ken's fractured mind, the beginnings of an idea formed. Something about promises and community and veterans who needed what he'd been given. Something that might honor Shirley's vision while giving Ken the purpose he'd been searching for since coming home from war. But first, the custody hearing. First, keeping Brenda. First, proving that broken fathers could still build futures worth fighting for. Ken stood pulling Brenda to her feet. "Come on, treasure hunter. Let's go find out what else Aunt Shirley left us to discover." They climbed the stairs together, Ranger leading the way, returning to a house that was beginning to feel less like a mystery and more like a mission. And for a soldier who'd spent 3 years fighting for causes he barely understood, having a mission felt like coming home. 4 months transformed Whitmore Manor from haunted fortress into something that breathed with purpose. Spring arrived late in the Montana mountains, snow melting to reveal ground that hadn't been worked in decades. Pine forests shed their white burdens to stand green against impossible blue sky. Ken worked the land with hands that had forgotten what creation felt like after years of survival mode, teaching Brenda skills his grandfather had taught him before the family fractured into pieces too sharp to reassemble. The custody hearing had ended in victory so complete that even the Clark family's expensive attorney had recommended withdrawal. Stable housing documented. Community support letters from 30 Ridgemont residents. Financial security beyond question. The judge had looked at documentation, then at Brenda's face, when asked where she wanted to live, and the answer had been obvious. Brenda had testimony prepared rehearsed with Rebecca's gentle coaching. But in the end, she'd simply stood and stated with 9-year-old certainty, "My dad isn't perfect, but he's mine, and I'm staying with him." The courtroom had erupted in applause from Ridgemont residents who'd packed every bench. Ken had cried in front of strangers who'd become family faster than biology ever managed. Ron hadn't attended. Neither had Pamela. Their legal challenges to Shirley's will had collapsed when Rebecca produced documentation so thorough that Coleman himself had advised immediate withdrawal. Whatever crimes Ron had committed, Shirley had chronicled them with prosecutorial precision. The threat of exposure proved more powerful than greed. Now spring brought possibility. Brenda helped Ken repair the generator, housing her small hands fitting into spaces his couldn't reach, passing tools with the efficiency of a surgical nurse. She'd absorbed carpentry basics with frightening speed, measuring twice cutting, once understanding that mistakes with wood were lessons, but mistakes with people sometimes couldn't be fixed. They worked side by side most mornings, building skills and structures, both while Ranger patrolled the property with the contentment of a dog who'd finally found permanent posting. The idea emerged during breakfast one morning in the newly renovated kitchen. Brenda had been sketching in her notebook drawings of rooms and people and possibilities. She slid the paper across the table, syrup sticky from the pancakes Betty had taught her to make. "Daddy, what if other kids whose parents have PTSD could come here not forever, but like to learn that it's okay?" Ken studied the drawing, a child's rendering of Whitmore Manor, but with additions, playground equipment, gardens, multiple families visible through windows. The vision was ambitious, almost overwhelming, but it carried logic that punched through Ken's instinctive resistance to grand plans. He'd spent months in VA waiting rooms, watching veterans struggle in isolation, watching their families fracture under pressure. That community could have eased. Shirley had built this estate over 40 years. Maybe it was meant for more than one small family's salvation. You're talking about turning our home into a center for veterans and their kids. Brenda nodded vigorously, dark hair catching morning light. Whitmore Haven. We could call it Whitmore Haven. She helped people in Ridgemont for years. Now we help people everywhere. The name settled into Ken's chest with weight that felt like destiny or responsibility or both. Rebecca had mentioned that Shirley's liquid assets required management decisions, that $18 million couldn't simply sit in accounts accumulating without purpose. Ken had been paralyzed by the enormity, unable to imagine himself as someone who controlled that kind of wealth. But Brenda's vision provided framework. Use it for healing. Transform personal salvation into communal resource. Build what Shirley had spent her life building, refuge for those the world had broken. That's a big project, baby. That's years of work, lots of people, constant responsibility. Brenda met his eyes with Michelle's unflinching directness. You're always saying PTSD doesn't make you broken, just hurt. Hurt people helping hurt people. That's what makes everyone better, right? Ken recognized his own therapy mantras reflected back, refined through a child's clarity into something approaching wisdom. He'd been teaching Brenda that trauma was survivable, that asking for help showed strength, that community mattered more than individual suffering. Now she was asking him to embody those principles at scale. Okay, let's do it. Ken extended his hand formally. Whitmore Haven Veterans and Family Recovery Center, partners. Brenda shook solemnly, then grinned. Partners, can I design the kids' wing? You can design whatever you want, treasure hunter. This is your legacy too. The months that followed blurred into construction, managed by Harold and his network of retired builders who worked for rates that barely covered materials. The community understood that Whitmore Manor becoming a recovery center meant Ridgemont would become a destination for people seeking healing, and healing populations needed infrastructure. Betty's diner expanded. The medical clinic added staff. The town itself transformed alongside the estate economic revival, following Shirley's final gift like spring following winter. Ken divided time between physical labor and bureaucratic navigation, learning nonprofit structures with Rebecca's patient guidance, while his hands remembered skills dormant since before deployment. Brenda worked alongside him when school allowed, and on weekends the entire town seemed to converge on the property, bringing food expertise stories about Shirley that revealed a woman even more complex than her journal suggested. Betty told how Shirley had funded the clinic anonymously when Harold's wife needed cancer treatment the hospital wouldn't cover. Doc Patterson explained Shirley's scholarship program that had sent 17 local kids to college over 3 decades. Donald described how Shirley had bought the failing lumber mill in 2008 just to keep it operating through the recession, saving 40 families from bankruptcy. Shirley had been Ridgemont's invisible guardian. Now they were determined that her heir would succeed in ways she'd never been permitted to attempt publicly. The first resident families arrived in late summer. Mark Williams came with luggage and 12-step chips, looking for space where his missing sobriety and nightmares wouldn't define him completely. Jessica Taylor brought daughter Ashley and enough medication to stock a pharmacy, exhausted from field hospital memories that wouldn't fade. Danny White arrived with his wife and 2 kids, traumatic brain injury, making simple conversations feel like navigating minefields. Brenda appointed herself unofficial greeter and guide, showing new children around with proprietary pride, explaining where everything was and why the house didn't need to be scary, even though it looked like it should be haunted. She organized kids into informal groups based on age and interest, created a lending library from Shirley's collection, established rules about respecting quiet time, and always telling an adult if parents seemed too sad to function. 9 years old and already understanding that children often parented their parents through the hardest moments, Ken watched his daughter bloom into something he hadn't anticipated. Not just survivor, but leader. Not just victim of circumstance, but architect of solutions. She reminded him constantly that healing wasn't about eliminating damage, but learning to build around it, that broken things could become stronger at the mended places if the repair work was done with care rather than shame. Ranger's role evolved too. The dog who'd spent 3 years keeping one broken veteran functional discovered purpose in training new service dogs, teaching rescue animals the specific skills that combat veterans needed. The K-9 program became central to Whitmore Haven, and Ranger appointed himself head instructor with the seriousness of a career NCO who understood that training could mean the difference between functioning and drowning. By October 20, veterans and their families called Whitmore Manor home, with waiting lists growing weekly. Ken had hired staff therapists, medical personnel, administrative support, transforming Shirley's private refuge into professional operation. The vault's contents funded everything barely touching the principal, while interest alone covered operational costs that would have bankrupted conventional nonprofits. Shirley had built an empire specifically so it could be dismantled into something better. The transformation nearly complete. Ken stood one evening on the front porch watching Brenda play tag with Ashley and 3 other children whose laughter echoed off mountains that had known only silence for decades. Ranger supervised from his favorite spot, the old dog's muzzle showing gray, but his eyes still sharp and protective. This was what victory looked like. Not military triumph or legal conquest, but simply space where damaged people could attempt repair without judgment. Then a car appeared on the drive, expensive and out of place. Ken's chest tightened, recognizing the vehicle even before it pulled close enough to confirm. 10 months since that blizzard drive to Montana, 6 months of silence. And now Ron returned at the moment when Ken finally felt secure in what they'd built. The timing couldn't be coincidence. Brenda noticed and moved to Ken's side instantly, her hand finding his. "Should I get Sheriff Donald?" "Not yet. Let's see what he wants." Ken called Ranger, who came immediately and positioned himself as barrier. "But stay close." Ron emerged from the vehicle, looking nothing like the polished executive who'd dismissed Ken in Manhattan. The suit was cheap or rumpled from travel. His face carried lines that hadn't existed 6 months ago, exhaustion etched deep enough to read from 20 feet. He moved slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching territory where he knew himself unwelcome. Pamela followed from the passenger side, and her transformation was even more stark. Designer clothes replaced by practical jeans and fleece. No jewelry, no makeup, just a woman who looked fundamentally tired in ways wealth couldn't address. They approached the porch steps and stopped waiting for permission to come closer. Ken descended to meet them, keeping himself between them and Brenda. "You're trespassing again." Ron raised both hands empty and non-threatening. "I know. I'm not here to cause trouble, Kenneth. I'm here to—" His voice cracked. "I'm here to ask for help." The words landed wrong, impossible, coming from someone whose entire identity had been built on having more, being better, winning every contest that mattered, and some that didn't. Ron asking for help made as much sense as gravity reversing. Pamela spoke next, her voice stripped of its cruel edge. "We lost everything. The house, the investments, my marriage to Ron, because I finally realized what he was. I'm living in a motel outside town. I have $300 and a nursing degree I haven't used in 15 years because I was too busy being a trophy wife." Ken processed this, calculating whether it was manipulation or genuine desperation. Ron had controlled millions. Their mother's inheritance alone should have sustained comfortable lives indefinitely. For both of them to be destitute required catastrophic decisions or systematic destruction. What happened to the $12 million? Ron laughed, the sound hollow and self-aware. Legal fees, $800,000 fighting Shirley's will, another $400 fighting your custody case. Then the IRS investigation started. He met Ken's eyes. Somebody sent them documentation about discrepancies in my tax filings going back 15 years. Coleman abandoned ship when the criminal exposure became real. Without his firm's protection, other creditors came calling. The house was mortgaged for loans I'd hidden from Pamela. The investments were leveraged against debts I couldn't cover. Ron's shoulders sagged. It collapsed fast, Kenneth. 3 months from comfortable to bankrupt. The story tracked with Rebecca's warnings about Ron's financial crimes. Shirley's documentation had been insurance against exactly this scenario, ensuring that if Ron attacked his own exposure, would force retreat. But Ken hadn't released anything to authorities, which meant someone else had accessed Shirley's archived evidence and decided Ron needed to face consequences regardless of whether Ken pursued them. "You think I reported you. Doesn't matter who. You had the documentation. You threatened to use it. The threat was enough to make me realize I'd destroyed my life, chasing money I didn't need from family I should have protected." Ron's eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "I was wrong about everything. About you, about Shirley, about what matters, and I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway." Brenda tugged Ken's sleeve, her whisper carrying urgency. "Daddy, can we talk just us?" Ken excused himself and walked with Brenda out of Ron's earshot. She studied him seriously, weighing something in her child's mind that adults often missed. "Uncle Ron looks like you used to look, after Mama died, before we came here." The observation hit hard because it was accurate. Ron carried the same hollow-eyed desperation Ken had worn for 2 years, the expression of someone who'd lost everything and couldn't find solid ground. Ken had survived that fall because Ranger had been there, because Brenda had needed him, because Shirley had built a safety net from beyond the grave. Ron had no equivalent support. "That doesn't mean we have to help him, baby. He was cruel to us." "I know, but you always tell the veterans here that healing is possible if you're willing to work. What if Uncle Ron is willing—" Brenda's expression carried the simple logic of someone who hadn't learned cynicism yet. "What if giving him a chance is what Aunt Shirley would want?" Ken wanted to reject the idea immediately. Ron didn't deserve redemption. He'd spent decades being exactly who he'd chosen to be, cruel, greedy, willing to destroy family for advantage. But Shirley's journals had revealed her own history, her father's abuse, her flight from family that had tried to break her. She'd spent 40 years building wealth specifically to protect Ken from that same cruelty. Would she want the cycle to continue? Or would she want Ken to be strong enough to break it? If we let him stay, he works. Real work, physical labor, no special treatment. And he sees a therapist. And if he slips once, just once, he's gone. Brenda nodded seriously. That's fair. Redemption has to be earned. They returned to where Ron and Pamela waited. Ken crossed his arms, studying his brother with the tactical assessment he'd applied to uncertain allies in combat zones. Whitmore Haven has a work program, manual labor, groundskeeping, kitchen duty maintenance, minimum wage. You'd live in staff quarters, no executive decisions, no management role, no authority over anyone, including yourself, until you've proven you've changed. Ron swallowed hard. I'll do it. Whatever you need. And therapy. Weekly sessions with Doc Patterson's referral network. You work on why you became who you were, or you don't stay. Ken shifted his attention to Pamela. Medical wing needs another nurse. Jessica Taylor runs it, but could use support. Same conditions. Work therapy, earning trust rather than demanding it. Pamela's eyes filled. Thank you. God, Kenneth, thank you. I can't explain how sorry I am about everything. Don't explain. Show me. Show Brenda. Show the veterans here who are doing the hard work of healing without making excuses. Ken stepped back. 6 months probation. After that, we decide if it's permanent. Brenda moved forward before Ken could stop her, positioning herself directly in front of Ron. Her voice carried the solemnity of someone delivering an oath. You hurt my dad really bad. You made him think he wasn't good enough. That's mean and it's wrong, and you should be ashamed. Ron knelt to her eye-level, tears visible. I am ashamed, more than you can understand. Good. Shame means you know you did wrong. Now you fix it. Brenda glanced back at Ken. My dad taught me that broken things can be fixed if you work hard enough. But you have to really work, not pretend work. Real work. I will. I promise. Promises are easy. Keeping them is hard. Brenda stepped back, clearly finished with her judgment. Ranger will know if you're lying. Dogs always know. Ranger, still watching from the porch, lifted his head as if acknowledging his role as truth detector. Ron managed a weak smile. I believe that. Your dog is smarter than most people I know. The first months of Ron and Pamela's residence at Whitmore Haven tested every principle Ken had claimed to believe about redemption and second chances. Ron struggled with physical labor that was beneath what he'd considered appropriate for someone of his background, blistering his hands on shovels and rakes, collapsing exhausted after days that barely qualified as normal for the other staff. Pamela relearned nursing skills she'd let atrophy working under Jessica's supervision with the humility of someone who understood her expertise had expired along with her confidence. Brenda appointed herself unofficial monitor, reporting to Ken with brutal honesty about effort levels and attitude changes. She'd inherited Michelle's ability to read people, to spot genuine transformation versus performed compliance. After 2 weeks, she announced, Uncle Ron is really trying. He's slow, and he complains to himself, but he doesn't quit. Pamela cried yesterday when Ashley thanked her for the bandage on her knee. I think they're both really sad about who they used to be. Ken trusted his daughter's assessment more than his own judgment. His perspective was too close, too colored by decades of wounds that didn't heal just because Ron now pushed a lawnmower instead of signing checks. But Brenda saw with fresh eyes, and her gradual acceptance of Ron's presence gave Ken permission to consider that maybe possibly people could change if the consequences were severe enough and the desire genuine. Ranger's endorsement came slower, but mattered more. The dog ignored Ron completely for the first month, treating him as furniture rather than threat or friend. Then one afternoon, Ken watched Ranger approach Ron during a break sniff carefully and accept a tentative pat before walking away. Not friendship, but acknowledgement, the dog's seal of approval for someone who'd crossed from enemy to neutral territory. By month 4, Ron had integrated enough that other veterans occasionally invited him to join therapy groups. The breakthrough came during a session about family damage and inherited trauma, when Ron broke down describing his own father's impossible standards, the constant message that achievement was the only measure of worth, the way love had been withheld until Ron learned to perform rather than exist. Ken listened from the doorway, uninvited, but unable to leave, and recognized patterns he'd never considered. They'd been raised by the same poison, just metabolized differently, Ron becoming the abuser to avoid being victimized, Ken internalizing worthlessness to avoid confrontation. Understanding didn't equal forgiveness, but it created space where forgiveness might eventually grow. The grand opening ceremony for Whitmore. Haven attracted media attention Ken hadn't anticipated. National news crews documented the story of a disowned veteran, transforming inheritance into community resource, human interest angles about resilience and redemption that played well with audiences hungry for hope. The Montana governor attended, promising state support for replicating the model elsewhere. Veteran organizations sent representatives asking detailed questions about funding models and outcome metrics. But what mattered more than officials and cameras was the community that filled every available space, Ridgemont residents who'd supported the transformation, veteran families who'd found healing here, and children who'd learned that trauma didn't define futures if adults were brave enough to address it honestly. Brenda had insisted on speaking despite Ken's protective resistance to putting his daughter in front of cameras. She prepared remarks with typical thoroughness, practicing until every word carried weight without seeming rehearsed. When her turn came, she stepped to the podium in her best dress and adjusted the microphone with composed confidence. "Hi, I'm Brenda Moore. I'm 10 now." Her voice carried clearly stronger than her size suggested. "A year ago, my dad and I came to Montana because we had nowhere else to go. People said my dad couldn't take care of me because he has PTSD. They wanted to take me away from him." Ken stood off to the side, hands clenched, watching his daughter speak truths that should have remained private but needed to be heard publicly. "My dad isn't broken. He's healing. There's a difference. When you break your arm, it hurts for a while, but then it gets better if you take care of it right. PTSD is like that, except it's your brain that got hurt instead of your arm. My dad's brain got hurt in the war, but he's taking care of it, and it's getting better." Brenda paused, glancing at Ken for strength, then continued. People think kids with parents who have PTSD need to be rescued, but we don't need rescuing. We need people to understand that our parents are heroes who are dealing with hero injuries. And we need places like Whitmore Haven where families can heal together instead of being torn apart. The crowd remained absolutely silent, every eye on the small girl speaking with authority beyond her years. My great-aunt Shirley built this place for us because she knew what it felt like when family doesn't believe in you. She knew my dad was strong enough to turn hurt into helping. And she was right. Look around, 45 veterans and their families live here now. 12 kids are my friends. Everyone is getting better because we're doing it together. Brenda's voice strengthened conviction, overriding nervousness. Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared. My dad was scared when we drove through that blizzard to get here. I was scared too, but we did it anyway. And now we have a home, a real home where broken families can become whole again. She stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause that built until it felt like physical force. Ken met her at the podium edge, wrapping her in a hug, while cameras captured the moment for evening news broadcasts. Brenda whispered against his chest, "Did I do okay? You were perfect, absolutely perfect." The celebration continued through afternoon, but Ken's favorite moment came after official proceedings ended. Brenda organized the children into a presentation for their parents, demonstrating skills they'd learned and growth they'd achieved. Ashley, who'd been silent for 6 months when she arrived, sang a solo that made her mother weep. Every child presented evidence that trauma could be survived, that families could recover, that Whitmore Haven delivered on its promises. Ron approached during the children's presentation, hesitating before speaking. "She's remarkable, Brenda. She's everything you and Michelle were at your best." Ken accepted the observation without responding. Complimenting Brenda didn't erase cruelty, but it suggested Ron had developed capacity to recognize value beyond his own interests. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything else, but," Ron's voice caught, "could I possibly stay after the 6 months? Not because I need the job, but because being here is the first time I've felt like I was contributing something worth more than the salary." "That's not my decision alone." Ken watched Brenda orchestrating the children with natural authority. "You'd need approval from the community board and from Brenda. She gets veto power over who stays permanently." Ron nodded, accepting terms that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "That's fair. She's a better judge of character than most adults." The evening wound down with veterans and families gathering in the Great Hall for the final ceremony, lighting 45 candles, representing every resident who had found refuge at Whitmore Haven. Brenda lit the first candle from Shirley's old studio lamp, then passed the flame to others until the room glowed warm and golden. Donald raised a glass in toast. "To Shirley Whitmore, who knew that the best revenge against those who doubt you is building something beautiful they can't touch." Ken lifted his glass alongside 50 others. "To Shirley." The words echoed, multiplied, transformed into something approaching prayer or gratitude, or both. Ken felt Michelle's absence sharply in moments like these, wished she could see what they'd built, what their daughter had become. But he also felt Shirley's presence not supernatural, but tangible in every board Harold had cut, every meal Betty had cooked, every therapy session that had broken someone open so they could finally heal. The estate was Shirley's final masterpiece, and Ken was just the caretaker, ensuring her vision outlived her mortality. 1 year later, Brenda's birthday fell on a crystalline October afternoon temperature, perfect for the outdoor celebration she'd requested. Ken had tried to keep it small, but the Havens community had other ideas. 60 people gathered around tables laden with food, children running wild, while adults supervised with the relaxed vigilance of those who trusted their village. Betty had baked a cake decorated with horses and mountains, and Brenda's squeal of delight made every painstaking hour worth the effort. Ken gave her the gift he'd been planning for months, a rescue puppy from the local shelter, 8 weeks old, German Shepherd with Ranger's coloring. Brenda named her Legacy immediately after Michelle's middle name, and Ranger approached the puppy with grandfatherly patience, beginning training that would eventually produce another service dog for the program. Ron and Pamela approached with their own gift, wrapped carefully in paper Brenda recognized as being from the craft supplies she'd donated to the children's art room. "We made this together. It's not much, but—" Brenda unwrapped a wooden box, beautifully crafted, carved with the same vine pattern that decorated Shirley's furniture. Inside, a collection of photographs, Shirley at different ages, Ken and Michelle at their wedding, Brenda as a baby. Someone had assembled a family history that had never existed in one place, creating continuity across generations that had been fractured. "How did you get these?" Pamela's smile was tentative. "I found them in your grandmother's storage unit. She kept everything, even photos of people she pretended not to love. I thought you should have them. Your family history." Brenda hugged the box close, then surprised everyone by hugging Ron. "Thank you, Uncle Ron. This is the best present." Ron's expression cracked years of performed confidence, giving way to genuine emotion. "You're welcome, Brenda. You've taught me more about being family than anyone in our bloodline ever did." The party stretched into evening, children and adults playing games that required no expertise, just willingness to participate. Ken watched from the porch as Brenda led a complicated tag variant that involved 3 teams and rules that seemed to change every 5 minutes. Ranger supervised while Legacy tumbled around his feet, already showing the intelligence that would make her exceptional if training went well. Rebecca appeared beside Ken with 2 glasses of wine. "You did it. Shirley's vision made real." "Brenda did it. I just followed her lead." Ken accepted the glass. "She's stronger than I ever was. She learned from watching you refuse to break." Rebecca's tone carried the fondness of someone who'd witnessed the entire transformation. "Shirley chose well, both of you." They stood in comfortable silence while celebration continued around them until Brenda noticed Ken watching and waved enthusiastically. He waved back, chest almost painfully full with gratitude for the series of unlikely events that had brought them to this moment. Shirley's foresight, Brenda's courage, a community's willingness to embrace strangers, and his own stubborn refusal to surrender when surrender seemed rational. 2 years after arriving in Montana, Ken barely recognized the man he'd been. The estate had expanded to accommodate 80 veteran families with satellite programs, launching in 3 other states. The K-9 training program had placed 30 service dogs with veterans nationwide. Brenda, now 12, ran a peer support network for children of combat veterans that had grown to 500 members across 4 time zones. And Ken had published a memoir about PTSD recovery that was being used in VA hospitals as proof that healing, while not guaranteed, was achievable with proper support. Ron had stayed approved unanimously by the community board after Brenda's endorsement. He ran the maintenance department, now teaching carpentry to veterans who needed skills and purpose. Pamela had become Jessica's partner managing the medical wing, her nursing expertise combined with hard-won humility, making her effective in ways her privileged past had never allowed. Neither would ever fully repair the damage they'd inflicted, but they were building something redemptive from ruins of who they'd been. Ken proposed to Rebecca on the anniversary of his arrival, kneeling in Shirley's studio with Brenda and Ranger as witnesses. Rebecca accepted with the practical warmth he'd learned to cherish, understanding that marriage for people their age meant combining existing families rather than starting fresh. Brenda had immediately begun planning the wedding with enthusiasm that suggested she'd been waiting for this development. The invitation list grew to 200 before Ken gently suggested that maybe possibly a smaller ceremony might be more manageable. Brenda had looked at him with Michelle's direct gaze and stated flatly, "Daddy, everyone here is family now. You can't exclude family." She was right, as she usually was. The wedding became community celebration held on the estate grounds with Donald officiating and half of Ridgemont in attendance. Brenda served as maid of honor, delivering a toast that made everyone cry. "Rebecca's not replacing my mom. Nobody could. But she's teaching me that love doesn't run out just because you give it to more people. We're not a small family getting bigger. We're a big family that finally found all its pieces." But the most significant transformation was internal. Ken's PTSD remained some wounds never fully closed, but he'd learned to manage symptoms that once controlled him. Therapy helped, medication helped, community helped most, knowing that when panic attacks came, he was surrounded by people who understood, who'd sit with him without judgment until the storm passed, made the attacks less frequent and less devastating. Ranger, now 11 and officially retired from active service, spent his days supervising the K-9 program from a comfortable bed in Ken's office. Legacy, fully trained, had been placed with a Marine who'd lost both legs in Fallujah and needed a partner who understood that mobility came in many forms. The chain of healing continued: dogs helping veterans, helping dogs, helping more veterans. Endless cycle of redemption that Shirley had initiated by believing one broken soldier deserved another chance. On a quiet afternoon in late autumn, with leaves turning gold and the first hints of winter approaching, Ranger's breathing changed. Ken knew before the vet confirmed it. The old dog's time had come. They gathered in Shirley's studio, Ken, Brenda, Rebecca, Ron, the entire Haven community. Ranger lay on his favorite blanket, surrounded by people who'd learned from him that loyalty wasn't conditional and love didn't require perfection. Ken held the dog's head, feeling the steady heartbeat that had regulated his own for 7 years. "Good boy, you were such a good boy." Ranger's tail moved once, slowly. His eyes found Ken's and held. Then the breathing stopped, and the dog who'd saved Ken's life 47 counted times went still. The funeral drew 200 people. Veterans, families, Ridgemont residents. They buried Ranger on Whitmore property under an oak tree where the dog had loved to sit. Ken's eulogy was short because words felt inadequate. Ranger taught me that love is patient work, not grand gestures. That showing up every day matters more than being perfect any day. That the things worth saving are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Legacy, the young dog Ranger had trained, sat beside the grave at attention, understanding in her own way that something fundamental had shifted. They didn't cry. They'd cried enough. This was gratitude for a life well lived and purpose well served. 5 years after inheriting Whitmore Manor, Ken stood in Shirley's studio holding the final letter his aunt had left. Behind her portrait in the hiding spot, Brenda had discovered an envelope labeled, "Open when Haven serves 100 families." Haven had reached that milestone last month. Inside Shirley's handwriting, still strong, despite having been written during her final weeks. Kenneth, if you're reading this, you've proven worthy of everything I believed you could be. 100 families, 100 second chances, 100 proofs that broken things build stronger when mended with care. I have one final gift. Commercial property in Billings, $8 million worth specifically for Haven expansion. The deed is enclosed. This is for the next 100 families. But more important than money is this truth. You didn't inherit wealth. You inherited purpose. Use it to build what I couldn't, a family that chooses each other. The worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for someone else's salvation. You've proven that every day for 5 years. I'm not afraid of death, Kenneth. I'm grateful. Grateful I lived long enough to see you find your way home. With all the love I never got to give in person, Aunt Shirley. Ken read the letter 3 times, then called Brenda up to the studio. She was 13 now, taller, her face losing the roundness of childhood, but retaining the fierce kindness that had defined her since birth. Together they read Shirley's final instructions, then sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset over mountains that had witnessed their entire transformation. "She knew we'd make it, Daddy. She always knew." "Yeah, baby, I think she did." Outside the estate glowed with lights from 100 families who'd found sanctuary here. The K-9 program had placed 80 dogs. Brenda's peer network reached 2,000 kids nationally. Ron managed 12 Haven locations across 6 states, having transformed from villain to essential team member through 5 years of consistent effort. Pamela ran the medical wing with competence earned through humility and sustained commitment. And Ken had finally learned that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting up every single time and helping others rise alongside you. A vehicle pulled up the drive headlights, cutting through dusk. Ken and Brenda descended to meet it. A veteran father stepped out, daughter beside him, 9 years old, scared, uncertain. The same age Brenda had been 5 years ago. The father's voice carried the exhaustion Ken remembered too well. "I heard about this place. I don't know if we belong here, but you belong because you showed up." Brenda stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd walked this path and knew its destination. "Come inside. I'll show you your room. We have hot chocolate and dogs and people who understand." Ken watched his daughter lead them toward the house exactly as Rebecca had led him 5 years ago. The cycle continued. The mission persisted, and somewhere in the space between loss and recovery, between breaking and building Ken had found what Shirley always intended him to discover, that family wasn't blood, it was choice. And purpose wasn't given, it was forged through the daily decision to show up for people who needed what you'd learned the hard way. The house waited, lights glowing, doors open, proving that broken things, when mended with care rather than shame, became stronger at the seams. Ken followed Brenda inside, ready to welcome the next family home.